I can remember being fascinated with the art of first impression as a child because my dad was very keen on making good, strong first impressions. Although he worked full time at Ford Motor Company, he was also a part time musician. So he had this like entertainer stripe. And as I grew up, my dad had a few aphorisms, sayings that he repeated endlessly. Perhaps your father and mother did too. And one of the things my father said over and over again was that if somebody should meet you and forget that they meet you, it's the worst insult ever. And it took me a while to really fully appreciate this, but what he was trying to say to me in his own way was that first impressions are extremely powerful, and that to the extent that you can differentiate yourself in that first encounter, it will not only help you understand people better, but they'll understand you better. If you're into functionality, you will understand how other people might be useful to you, and those people that you meet will understand almost instantly how you can be useful to them. So it's a great, great tool. First impressions happen very, very quickly. And that became apparent to me on a ride-along I did with a police officer in Charlevoix, Michigan, many, many years ago. An old high school chum of mine, Dan Frazier, was on the Charlevoix police force. When I called him to tell him I was coming to town, he said, "Would you like to do a ride-along in the police car?" I've never voluntarily gotten in a police car before. And he said, "You'll enjoy it, it'll be fun." And I said, "Well, would it be okay if I write an article about my experience?" He says, "That's why we do it. I know you're a writer, you're a speaker. We do these public relations things all the time, and it would be a chance for us to spend some time together." I said, "Let's do it, man." So one of the things that happened, and I think you'll be interested to hear today in this conversation about first impressions, is that when Officer Frazier pulled people over for speeding, a lot of things happen in the first 15 seconds. I mean, think about this. Think about the last time perhaps you got pulled over, if ever. By the time the officer gets out of the car, he knows who owns the vehicle. He doesn't know who's in the vehicle, but he knows who owns the vehicle. But he doesn't have access to the really important information, like what else might be in the vehicle. And Patrolman Frazier alerted me to some things that he did in the first 15 seconds of approaching the car that I never thought about before. He would pay strict attention to what's going on in the back seat. Is the trunk ajar? Sometimes he would rap on the trunk like this, perhaps to hear if, and I asked him later, I know for sure that's why he did it, to hear if the trunk sounded hollow or if it sounded full. One time he checked the latch of the trunk to make sure that it was secure. Being a police officer is a very dangerous job these days. When the police officer approaches the driver, the police officer doesn't stand in front of the driver where it's easy to have the conversation. Where does he stand? He kind of stands behind the driver back here, doesn't he? And why does he do that? Because a large percentage of people that this patrolman stops are right-handed. If there's a weapon in the car of any kind, mace, knife, a gun, it's going to take a few fractions of a second longer for that right hand to come across the seat. And so he wants to be in a place where he has those extra milliseconds to protect himself. By the way, there's always a post in the car, unless it's a convertible, that can come into play in case the officer needs to defend himself. So it's about caution and precaution, all to keep the officer safe. By the way, when the officer stops and you pull over on the side of the road like this, the police officer doesn't pull in behind you like this. How does he park his car? Like this, on an angle, with the butt end of his car into traffic, and that shields the officer as he gets out of his car to approach the driver's side of the vehicle. Sometimes, if there's not enough room, he goes all the way around to the passenger side. I say he, it could be a female officer. Now, the first 15 seconds of an interaction that you have day to day probably isn't risking your life. On the other hand, if you're a commissioned salesperson, I heard an insurance salesperson on the call today. If you're a commissioned salesperson, the quality of your presentations can determine how many weeks of vacation your family has this year, or what kind of food you buy for the refrigerator, or what kind of schools your kids go to. And if you are a leader of any kind and you need to marshal the troops to get them to do something, the quality of your presentation can determine the bottom line of your company this year. So first impressions are really, really important.